You guys know how much I love a good mystery. Recently, a subscriber to this channel brought me a mystery related to Amazing Fantasy 15. It was something that I just could not resist digging into. If you want to know the details of what I learned, and I know you do, stay tuned to this video. Reggie here, your friendly neighborhood bodybuilder and comic book collector, and I want to welcome you to another one of my videos. In this video, we are going to unravel a mystery related to Amazing Fantasy 15. But before we get there, we are going to lay a foundation, and we're going to talk about something called the Merry Marvel Marching Society. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of this. I hadn't until I started to look into it. But I guess back in the mid-60s, Marvel had its own in-house fan club. Now, with this fan club, a kid or an adult could send in a buck and they would receive merchandise directly from Marvel. All kinds of little tchotchkes, membership card and, decals and posters and all that kind of cool stuff, a newsletter. And at some point, the editor of Marvel decided that this in-house fan club was too expensive to maintain. And so they decided to spin it off. They decided to privatize it. So there was an executive in Culver City, California that basically said, I will essentially buy this fan club and I will license from you, Marvel, your characters. Whenever I create merchandise, I will pay you a fee to license those characters. And this was much to the chagrin of Stan Lee, who believed that this fan club was a great PR source for Marvel. They overrode him, they spun it out, and this executive in California essentially started a new fan club by, incorporating the old into his new thing. And there is some uncertainty around whether this executive ever really paid Marvel the money to license these characters. And there is also some uncertainty of whether this gentleman ever really fulfilled his obligations to all of the subscribers to his fan club. Now, it's neither here nor there, but essentially what would happen is that a child or an adult or whoever would send in $1.75 plus 25 cents postage and handling, and they would receive merchandise from this fan club. They would receive a newsletter, a magazine. They would also get a poster of Captain America, a decal of Incredible Hulk, a membership card. They would receive these little tchotchkes as a way of saying, hey, you are an insider in Marvel. And they were basically producing a really cool magazine. Now, what's interesting about this magazine is that they were, to some degree or another, really dependent upon the artists and the writers and the editors over at Marvel. So you look at the covers of the magazine that they were producing, and these covers feature artwork, sometimes original artwork, unpublished artwork from some pretty well-known artists, including Jack Kirby. The magazine featured articles from writers and editors that were employed by Marvel. So these guys, even though they were outside of the Marvel organization, were very dependent upon what was happening in Marvel. And what was really cool is that if you read some of these articles, they were actually giving these fans a tremendous amount of insight into the inner workings of Marvel. And for the 70s, that had to be really cool to be able to see and hear and to read about what was actually happening inside of the corporate offices of Marvel. So you might be asking, what does this have to do with Amazing Fantasy? All right, if you're asking that question, it is a perfectly rational question to ask. And that actually brings me to the next point. So a subscriber to the channel basically reached out to me and said, hey, I have a mystery related to Amazing Fantasy. And, I'm all ears, right? You're talking about Spider-Man. Tell me more. So we engaged in a little dialogue, and then I did some additional research on my own. And I've always known that the cover that was selected for Amazing Fantasy was not the original cover that was created. Steve Ditko created a cover for Amazing Fantasy, and he also did the interior panels. Stan Lee, and I think many of you know this, didn't like what Ditko put together. And so he reached out to Jack Kirby and said, Jack, Can you create me a better cover for Amazing Fantasy? Ultimately, Jack Kirby did that, and Stan Lee went with Kirby's cover. And that's the cover that we've all been staring at for decades, right? It's the one that we see up on a shelf and we're like, that's Amazing Fantasy, right? It never occurred to me what happened to Ditko's cover. I never really thought about it, to be honest with you. Maybe you guys have, but it never dawned on me to say, well, where is the cover? Whatever happened to the cover? Here's what happened to the cover. This is Marvel Mania Magazine 2. This is actually the second issue of that fan club we were just talking about. This is their magazine, the second issue of their magazine that they put out. And you'll notice that this cover right here is nothing to do with Spider-Man, right? This is Conan. This is actually the original sketch that was done by Barry Windsor Smith. And if you compare this sketch to the final version of Conan, you'll probably see some differences between this version and that version. And we'll get back to that in a moment. But what these guys were doing was basically using published, unpublished, and sketches from some well-known artists on both the front and the back of their magazine. There you have Amazing Fantasy 15, the original sketch that was done by Ditko. And as you look at this thing, you'll see some pretty interesting differences between this version and the version that we've all grown to know as Amazing Fantasy. And you'll see that there's lots of people down here on the ground. There's a couple of people hanging out of windows. You'll notice that, Spider-Man is a little slimmer than he is in the final version, and he's carrying someone under his arm there. In the version that Jack Kirby did, Kirby actually put Spider-Man higher in the air. He made him look much more amazing than he looks here, being maybe 2 stories off of the ground. He erased much of the background, right? So you don't see any people. He made it a little more stark than what you're seeing here. And that was the version, again, that Stan preferred to go with versus what you see here. Now, there is some cool writing on this thing, on this cover. It says, introducing in this epic surprise field issue, Spider-Man. Though the world may mock Peter Parker, the timid teenager, it will soon marvel at the awesome might of Spider-Man. So that's really cool, right? Some really cool, bold language that they're using right there. But there are some marked differences between the Ditko cover and the Kirby cover. And honestly, I kind of like the Kirby cover better than this one, but this one is really cool. This is really cool. And this particular magazine was published in 1970, so a couple of years after when Amazing Fantasy was actually released in 62, and of course after when Amazing Spider-Man started in 63. This cover was used, I think, for Amazing Spider-Man 700, which is fine, but this again was shortly after, it was scratched, and they supposedly dug this out of the archives to be able to bring this issue forth in the 1970s. So let's get back to this front cover here. If you are a Conan fan, you've probably looked at this before, and you probably noticed that there's a couple of differences, right? One of the differences is that this sword, which is hidden behind this axe, in the final version is actually pointed towards the reader. The inker actually modified that. Barry Smith didn't. The inker actually modified the sword based upon input from the editors. The inker also straightened this axe. As you can see, Barry he didn't use a ruler, so it's a little curve there. The inker actually straightened out the axe. There's a word cloud covering this sword back here. And one of the other big differences to Conan is in the final version, you'll notice that his muscle isn't as grainy. In the final version, they smoothed out a lot of the knots and the texture to his muscles in the final version. But it's definitely still a really cool cover because this was the original sketch that was done, later modified, but it's cool to see the original of the Conan cover, and it's certainly really cool to see the original of Amazing Fantasy 15. Now, what's also cool about this is that this book was sent to me in the original envelope that was sent to the fan club subscriber back in the 70s. A guy by the name of Larry Mayer in New York actually received this envelope with that book back in the 70s. And it's kind of cool to see all this original stuff. The place that I bought it from actually enclosed it in a very large envelope to accommodate this little piece of history here, but definitely a cool thing. And one of the other things I found inside was the original letter that was sent in that envelope to entice people to continue their subscriptions to the fan club and also to order back issues. So just an awesome piece of history. I don't know how much this book is worth, but to me as a fan of Spider-Man, this is an awesome piece of history. This to me is similar to the videos that I did on the black costume for Spider-Man. This was just really cool. And yeah, they used the cover for Amazing Spider-Man 700, but it's cool to own this original piece that was released in the 70s. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. It was a fun video to make. If you know anything about this fan club or about this magazine, I highly encourage you guys to enter those details into the comment section. I'm still trying to learn about some of this stuff. So if you guys know more than me, I certainly welcome you guys adding to the discussion and to the dialogue. As always, thank you guys for taking the time to watch this video. Take care.